Hi, guys. Thanks for joining me on my webinar. Nice to have you all here. Mackenzie, Denali, Cypress. Great question, Mackenzie and Denali. We're not going to do the Oregon Trail today, but we're actually going to be talking about some of the transportation and different kinds of transportation that they came up with, which leads us actually to talking about the Oregon Trail. So we're going to talk about that really soon. Hi, Lorna. Hello, Cypress. Everybody, nice to have you guys here. What am I dressed as today? Well, I am dressed as a stagecoach driver today. And you can kind of see, sorry, I don't know which direction to move, but you can see in my background, I have a stagecoach. I'm not Robin a stagecoach. Haha, get it? Funny name joke. But just driving a stagecoach, not Robin them. Okay, great. So we are going to get started and we're going to talk a little bit about transportation and the different kinds of transportation that were developed at around the time that we're talking about. So I'm just going to get my slideshow up so that we can get started. We're talking about transportation. So here we go. Transportation routes in the 1800s. So yesterday, if you were with me, we talked a little bit about the new ways of producing new products and working and getting more done faster. And now we're going to be talking a little bit about transportation routes. And Isha, don't worry, you did not miss anything. I'm just explaining what we're going to talk about. So, Cypress, if you want to ask a question, make sure you type it into the Q&A box, okay? So although most of the East Coast of America was settled by the early 1800s, it wasn't easy to travel between the settlements and the west of the Appalachian Mountains. The land was still a wilderness. It was still like a frontier. And the roads were mainly dirt. And when it rained, they became really muddy and it was hard to travel through them. So imagine trying to pull a wagon through deep mud, which is actually what that picture is to my right. So there were people who wanted to go to the west, but they actually weren't able to because they got stuck in the mud. So where there were good rivers, it was easiest to pull goods, the things they were trying to sell, and people on boats and rafts and use the river to move them. But not every river was great for this. They had to be calm, so they had to not have a lot of movement in them, and they had to be deep enough for the boats to float on. So not every river could be used for this reason. And in 1804, 1805, and 1806, traveling on the river was how Lewis and Clark did much of their travel to get to the Pacific Ocean. They used both the Missouri and Columbia River. But not every river was perfect for this. If you wanted to take things by boat and you didn't have a river going where you needed to, you could sometimes dig what's called a canal. And a canal is a big, wide, and shallow ditch filled with water. You guys can see to the right, that's a picture of the canal. And so people would dig these canals, they'd fill them with water, and then they'd build special canal boats that didn't require deep water that could carry the cargo from a town to another town along the canal. And before they had engines, they used horses to pull the boats along, which you guys can see in the picture. And yes, Holly, great point. The canal is like the one that's in Panama. This is the sort of the beginning of that idea. Here I found some other pictures so that you guys can see some different pictures of canals. These ones are just, one is a drawing and two are pictures. The one in the top left is a old-fashioned picture from that time. And then the one in the top right is also a Christmas picture, I just noticed, because you can see in the background Santa Claus and his reindeer, which I don't really know why that is in that picture, but you can see the donkeys or the horses pulling the canal boats. And then the bottom one is a more modern picture where they are using the horses and like you can see like a little wagon or a buggy to pull the canal boat. So those are just some pictures of the canal boats. No problem being late, Ellie. I'm being dressed as a stagecoach driver, which we're going to talk about the stagecoaches a little bit later, which is why I'm dressed as one. So in 1807, an American whose name was Jesse Hawley, he knew very well that there weren't enough good roads or good rivers or canals. And he was a flour merchant. So what he did was he ground up wheat into flour and he sold flour to different people. And his business was actually failing because it was so hard for him to get his flour to his customers. There wasn't an easy way for him to transport it. He lived in the far corner of New York State and had to get his flour to New York City. So you guys can see where he lived is the star on the map. And he had to get his flour to the end of where the arrow is, where New York City is. And there were mountains in the way. There weren't any really good roads to take them over. And as you can see, there aren't really any rivers near there that could help him with getting his flour to New York City. And so he started to have to borrow money to keep his business running. So when you borrow money, that's called going into debt. And Hawley was going into debt deeply. He had to borrow a lot of money and he couldn't earn enough money to pay it back. And have any of you guys played Monopoly and had this happen to you? I know it definitely always happens to me. When I'm playing Monopoly. Well, if you borrowed this money and you couldn't pay it back, in 1807, the thing that you had to do was you were sent to a prison called debtor's prison. And you had to stay there until you could pay off your debt. And Hawley actually ended up being there for 20 months starting in August of 1807. And that was a bad thing. That was not a good thing that happened to him. But the good thing about it was that he had plenty of time to think. And so he came up with this idea that America should dig a big canal. And so his idea was to dig a canal from the Hudson River. So you guys can see where the blue arrow is on the right, that's the Hudson River, to Lake Erie, which is one of the Great Lakes. And he called it the Erie Canal. With the canal there, he could easily transport his flour over to the Hudson River and down to New York City. So remember, he's where the star is. So then he could easily take it to Hudson River and then down to New York City. Other people could use it for their trading from New York City to all the cities that were on the Great Lakes. And so businesses could continue to grow and people could make money and become prosperous. So that was his big plan, to build the Erie Canal. And just because he was stuck in prison at that time, it didn't stop Hawley from telling people about his idea. He wrote many letters from prison. So he started writing to a lot of people about this canal and about his idea to get people to support and believe in the same idea as him. So the canal would be almost 400 miles long, and many people said it would be impossible to build. They thought he was crazy. It was a crazy idea. But he kept writing, and he described all the details and the plans on how it could and should be built. Great question. What does prosperous mean? Prosperous means when you have enough money or you have a lot of money so that you can not only take care of the things you need, but you have extra that you could save or spend. So that was what he wanted to have happen. So finally, his letters reached a really important man, the mayor of New York City, who his name was DeWitt Clinton. And Mayor Clinton was smart enough to realize that Hawley's ideas were correct and that his plan would work. So he was someone, he wanted to help Hawley make these plans a reality. He knew that being able to transfer things from New York City to the other side of the state and sell them would bring prosperity or lots of money to New York City. And so he decided that he was going to support that project. Now people thought he was crazy for wanting to do that. So as the mayor of New York City, at first he didn't really have enough power to make that happen. All he could do was try to talk to people about it. But he didn't have the power to start the project. But then later he was elected as a senator for the state of New York, where he had a say in the making of the laws for the state. And now he had enough power to get more people on his side and get them to help him. And so actually in 1817, on July 4th, the Erie Canal was started. And they didn't have any earth-moving machines or bulldozers at that time. So now when they build a road or they have to build a tunnel through a mountain or something, they have these big machines that can help them, but they didn't have that then. So they had to have horses. They did have horses to help them, but they needed to dig all that earth that had to come out of it had to be dug by men themselves. And so they used some things called picks and shovels. You can maybe see the pick is in the picture down here right at the bottom, like the guy who's closest to me. And it is like sort of like an axe, but at one end it's got a really sharp point, and at the other end it has the same sharp point. So they would swing it, hit it, loosen the dirt, and the shovel is obviously a shovel. So they used those picks and shovels to dig out that canal. Sometimes they had to use gunpowder, and they would light it and it would blow up and that would blast away the rocks. But during all that construction, when they were building it, many people still thought Clinton was crazy and that it would never be completed or that it would never work. Oh, Lily, it's okay for being late. I am a Stagecoach driver. So we're talking about the different types of transportation that was being created, different ways of transportation being created in the 1800s, and that stagecoaches were one of them. So that's who I dressed up as. Great question, Ellie. What did the gunpowder do? Well, the gunpowder exploded. So what they would do is they would put gunpowder in some way, maybe in like a barrel or a container, and they would run a fuse or a piece of rope or cloth or something out of it. They'd go a safe distance away, they'd light it, the fire would travel up to it, and then boom, and that would help sort of break apart or blow apart some of the rocks that they couldn't get with the shovels or the picks. The senator's name is DeWitt Clinton. Okay, so they thought he was crazy and they thought it was never going to work, but he and James Hawley believed that it was a good plan. So there were some hills and small mountains between Lake Erie and the Hudson River. And you can see in this picture, if you look at this picture that's to the right, you can see that the men are on a hill and much higher than the part in the distance. So they didn't have enough gunpowder to blast that hill flat. And so they had to figure out a way to raise the water under the boats or lower in places. So they couldn't blast through it, but they had to figure out a way that they could get a boat from here to here. And Does anybody know how they did that? Well, sorry guys, I'm just trying to read your questions. That's right. Well, so there's something called a lock in the canal, and locks are actually a way that you can move a boat to a higher level of a canal or down to a lower level of a canal. So I hope you guys can see the little moving pictures that are at the bottom of my presentation. So the lock is actually the middle section where you see the boats mostly, and there's a gate at each end. So what they do is, like on the right, the boat, if it wants to go up to a higher level, it goes into the middle, they shut both ends of the gate, and then they put more water into it so that it rises to the higher level. Similarly, if you're coming from a higher level and you need to go to a lower level, you go into the lock, they shut both the gates, they take some of the water out, and then you can get to the lower side. So that was actually a way that when they couldn't build it so that it was all the same, height, that they could actually move the boats either up to the higher level or down to the lower level. That is right. It is also, Cypress, great point. It's sometimes also called a boat elevator. And they do. You're right. Anybody who's talking about the Panama Canal, in the Panama Canal, there are locks as well. Many canals use them so that as it's something that's really, really helpful. So finally, on October 26, 1825, after 7 years of work, the Erie Canal was completed. Governor Clinton, so now DeWitt Clinton was the governor. He was running the entirety of New York State. He planned a grand opening ceremony. And so even though Jesse Hawley hadn't worked on the construction of the canal, it was really his idea and his dream that caused it to be started. And they followed his ideas. So Governor Clinton considered Hawley to be the father of the Erie Canal. And so he invited him to the ceremony. And they actually, the picture on the right is Hawley pouring the first bucket of water into the Erie Canal. And so that was the beginning of it. And so this, you can see in my picture on the right, this is the final, that little line, that's like the line with the little dashes on it, is the final route of the Erie Canal, which was exactly the way that Hawley had planned it. And it connected, they had connected Lake Erie, so that's over here on the sort of lower left of the picture, with the Hudson River. So before the canal, to move cargo from one end to the other, they had to use ox wagon, and it would take about 30 days or even longer if they got stuck in the mud. And for each, and by ox wagon, it would cost $125 for each ton of cargo. So if they had more than 1 ton of cargo, it would cost more than $125 for each ton. But by using boats, it actually only took 9 days, and it was only $6 per ton. And they didn't have to worry about getting stuck in the mud. So it was faster and it was cheaper, which is really good news. So the Erie Canal was a great success. So, and it was, they started using it right away. Jesse Hawley, he lived until 1842. By that time, the state of New York was very prosperous. They were making lots of money. There was lots of businesses. They were buying and selling and making lots of things that other people wanted. And New York City was the busiest port in America. And a port is a place where ships come in and bring goods and then into a country. And it was just like he thought. So that was actually pretty good for a man who started this idea all while he was in debtor's prison. And they actually used the canal for 100 years after it was opened. So besides the Erie Canal, many more canals were built to help with transportation across the frontier. They would build canals to connect rivers or lakes. So it was just a way that they could get their things where they wanted them to go. But it wasn't just canals that they were going to build now. Some better roads were built as well. Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, decided that a national road was needed to connect the country together. And it actually went almost to the Mississippi River. He got the construction started in 1811, and it continued for over 20 years. So you guys can see in this picture, the red, I hope that shows up on your computer screen, but that red line is the national road, and it was 600 miles. It was paid for by the government of the United States, and it helped connect the states of Maryland, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois all together. So it was a way that you could easily travel or somewhat easily travel from one place to another. So when they built the national road, it was not just a dirt road that would turn to mud when it rained, which was the problem with roads before, because you could get stuck in the mud. They built it really well, and they covered it with gravel. And actually, this says it ran for 800 miles. So that's a lot of road that you could travel on. And the road was very busy. So the semi-truck, which is, if you don't know, is the truck that has the trailers attached to it, and it's the thing which carries our food and the things we buy from to the stores and to the grocery stores, and from factories to us. That's a semi-truck. So the semi-truck, the thing which transported a lot of goods at that time, was called the Conestoga wagon, and it hauled most of the heavy freight on that road. So a lot of the things that were heavy that had to be moved were moved by that. On the national road, it could make about 15 miles a day. So that doesn't really sound like a lot to us when driving 15 miles an hour is very slow, and it would take you 1 hour to get 15 miles. But at that time, it was really, really good. And often these wagons were pulled by teams of oxen, but sometimes they were pulled by horses. They would usually use oxen because the oxen were stronger, and they could eat the grass, and they didn't have to be fed like grains like the horses would. And they could pull heavier loads more easily. So oxen were usually the usual choice. So pioneers moving their families out west would often use the national road, like to go from Maryland to as far as they could. And they'd pile all their belongings into covered wagons, and they'd head out for new land on the frontier. Now we're going to get to the part where we talk about my costume, which is the stagecoach driver. So stagecoaches were filled with passengers, and they would travel the road. Stagecoaches were able to go faster than other wagons, and they actually changed teams often to keep the horses fresh. So what that means is that horses could only run or gallop or go so many miles a day before they got too tired, and then they would get slower and slower and slower. And so one of the things that they would do is the stagecoach would go for a certain amount with a certain set of horses, and then would swap to another set of horses. And this way, by doing that, they could travel almost 75 miles a day, which is a huge improvement over 15 miles per day. And you might actually be able to go from one end of the national road to the other one in only 10 or 11 days. Oxen, great question, Lily. Oxen are a type of cow, I think, like a cattle, kind of like a cow type animal that were usually bred to be really strong and they could pull a lot of weight. So besides just traveling on the national road, they also used it to rapidly move mail. So to get the mail where they wanted it to go. And people started building something called taverns along the road. So travelers could stop for a hot meal or a warm bed overnight. So that would be kind of like a hotel, but not exactly like it, but there'd be a kitchen there, there'd be kind of a restaurant or a cafe where you could get some warm food, and then a place to sleep. Because if it was going to take you 10 or 11 days to go from one end to the other, you're not really going to want to camp all that time, probably. You're probably going to want to be somewhere where you could be maybe more comfortable. So whole towns sprung up along the way of that national road, and it got so busy that a man actually counted almost 300 wagons passing in one day. Mina, oxen is kind of like buffalo, but not quite. It's strong and big like a buffalo, but it's not quite. So Thomas Jefferson's idea was a success for America and helped it grow. And you can see in this map that I have here, this is a little bit later of a map, but once the national road was built and there was an easy way or a somewhat easy way to get from Maryland to about Illinois, about there, that was kind of as far west as they had gone, they started to build more roads. So states started to build more roads that could hook up to the national road, and more canals were built to connect rivers and lakes. So what you guys can see is you can see the orange lines are the main roads. And cutting right across here, you can see like from Maryland to Illinois is the national road. It has a little, I'm not sure if you can read it, but it says National Road right above it. But you can see they also a road was built from Florida Territory all the way up to Philadelphia, New York, Boston. That's a lot of road. Or you could travel from Louisiana to Nashville, Tennessee, to Virginia, to New York City. So that, so those are the roads. The main canals are they look almost like railroads, but they're not really railroads. They just look like that to me. The line with the little dashes on it, you can see sort of the different canals that were built. Oops, sorry guys, just one sec. So by 1840, the transportation routes of the most settled part of America between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mississippi River were becoming much better, but there was still some frontier out west. So normally we wouldn't really think of, at least I wouldn't think of states like Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, Territory, Wisconsin, Illinois as the West. In our country today, we think of it as the Midwest, sort of the Middle West. But at that time, that was sort of as far as the settlers had settled. And so it was the West. But people were going to want to move out further west. So that actually, I know I'm a little short, guys, but that is all I have today. I hope you learned something about the transportation and the canals. And what we're going to be studying about next, just so you know, is we're going to be studying about the Oregon Trail. Someone who asked about the Oregon Trail. We're going to be studying about the Oregon Trail because creating these national roads and making it easier for people to travel and to take their things places was actually one of the things which made it easier, because it wasn't really easy, but made it easier for the people to move even further west and to settle in Oregon. Lily, great question. Are those roads still there? Yes, I do believe those roads are still there, but they've probably been covered up by other roads. Now we have a system of highways and interstate highways which connect all the states of the United States. And I think those were the first version of what became our interstate highways. Okay, great. I'll see if you guys have any last questions. Sorry, I'm just trying to get up to the Q&A. Well, thank you, Ellie, for joining us. I'm glad you enjoyed it, and I hope the rest of you guys have a good day as well. And I hope to see you next week when I do a couple more. So just as a reminder, if you're interested in finding out any more about these studies or anything that I base these on, you can always check out Heron Books. I'm glad you guys enjoyed it. Thank you so much. I hope to see you guys next time.